Des Plaines, Illinois, December 1978. Snow dusted the suburban streets where families prepared for Christmas, their homes glowing with warm light and holiday decorations. Children played in yards while their parents rushed to finish last-minute shopping. It was the epitome of American middle-class tranquility, a place where neighbors knew each other's names and crime seemed like something that happened in distant cities. But beneath the peaceful facade of 8213, West Somerdale Avenue, a horror beyond imagination was about to be revealed. In the crawl space under an ordinary ranch house lived a secret so monstrous that it would shatter the community's sense of safety forever and introduce the world to one of America's most prolific serial killers. John Wayne Gacy Jr. wasn't the boogeyman of children's nightmares. He was a successful businessman, a Democratic precinct captain, a beloved entertainer who dressed as Pogo the Clown to delight children. He was married, had stepchildren, and threw elaborate parties for his neighbors. He was, by all appearances, the embodiment of the American dream. The reality was far different. Behind his jovial public persona, Gacy was a predator who had turned his home into a tomb, burying the bodies of young men and boys beneath his house with the casual efficiency of a man tending a garden. This is the story of how a seemingly ordinary man became one of history's most notorious serial killers, and how the very qualities that made him appear trustworthy became the tools of his terrible crimes. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. From the outside, the Gacy family appeared typical of working-class Chicago families during the Great Depression era. John Sr. worked as a machinist and auto repair man, while Marion kept house and raised their three children, John Jr., Joanne, and Karen. But the Gacy household was far from harmonious. John Sr. was an alcoholic with a violent temper and impossibly high standards for his son. A World War I veteran who had never recovered from his experiences in the trenches, the elder Gacy ruled his family through intimidation and physical violence. He was particularly hard on his only son, viewing any sign of weakness or sensitivity as evidence of character flaws that needed to be beaten out of the boy. Young John Jr. was a sickly child, suffering from a heart condition that prevented him from participating in sports or other physically demanding activities. This only intensified his father's disappointment and abuse. John Sr. would call his son a mama's boy and a sissy, often in front of neighbors and relatives, humiliating the child and driving home the message that he was fundamentally inadequate. Marion Gacy, meanwhile, was a devoutly Catholic woman who tried to shield her son from her husband's worst excesses. She was loving and protective, but her influence was limited by her own fear of her husband's violent temper. The result was a household divided between extremes, a father who demanded impossible standards and punished failure with violence, and a mother whose love came with the implicit understanding that she was powerless to truly protect him. The psychological impact of this dynamic would shape John's entire life. He developed an intense need for approval and recognition, coupled with a deep-seated rage toward authority figures. He learned early that appearances mattered more than reality, that the right public face could hide private dysfunction. Most dangerously, he internalized his father's message that violence was an acceptable way to solve problems and assert control. School provided little refuge for young John. His heart condition, combined with his father's verbal abuse, had left him with low self-esteem and difficulty forming relationships with peers. He was often the target of bullies, and his attempts to fight back usually ended in humiliation. Teachers saw him as a quiet, unremarkable student who caused no trouble but showed no particular promise. As John entered adolescence, the patterns that would define his adult life began to emerge more clearly. He became increasingly skilled at compartmentalizing his life, presenting different faces to different people depending on what he thought they wanted to see. At school and in public, he was polite, well-mannered, and eager to please. He joined the Boy Scouts and threw himself into activities that might win him the approval he craved from adults. He was particularly drawn to positions of minor authority, patrol leader in Scouts, hall monitor at school, roles that gave him a taste of the power and respect he desperately wanted. But privately, John was developing disturbing patterns of behavior. He began experimenting with petty theft, stealing small items from stores and classmates. More troubling, he started showing an unhealthy interest in controlling and manipulating others. He would spread rumors to turn friends against each other, then position himself as the mediator who could resolve the conflicts he had created. His relationship with his father remained toxic throughout his teenage years. John Sr.'s drinking had worsened, and his verbal and physical abuse had escalated accordingly. John Jr. learned to avoid his father when possible and to present a facade of compliance when avoidance wasn't an option. But the rage was building, and he began to fantasize about revenge against his father and others who had wronged him. During this period, John also began to realize that he was attracted to men, a discovery that filled him with shame and confusion. In the conservative, Catholic environment of 1950 Chicago, homosexuality was not just stigmatized but considered deeply sinful and potentially criminal. Given his father's already poor opinion of him, John was terrified of what would happen if his sexual orientation were discovered. This fear drove him deeper into deception. He began dating girls, not out of genuine attraction but as a way of maintaining his cover. He became skilled at playing the role of a heterosexual teenager, learning to mimic the behaviors and attitudes expected of him. But the constant performance was exhausting, and the gap between his public and private selves continued to widen. After graduating from high school in 1960, John's life entered a period of apparent stability that masked growing internal turmoil. He enrolled briefly at Northwestern Business College but dropped out after just a few months. His father's reaction was predictably harsh, leading to a final confrontation that ended with John leaving home for good. He moved to Las Vegas, where he found work in the mortuary business, a job that would later take on sinister significance given his future crimes. John claimed he enjoyed the work, saying he found the quiet dignity of the funeral home appealing. But there were disturbing aspects to his employment that only became clear in retrospect. Co-workers noticed his unusual interest in the embalming process and his tendency to spend more time than necessary with the bodies. After several months in Las Vegas, John returned to Chicago, where he found work as a salesman for Nunn Bush Shoe Company. The job suited his personality perfectly. It required him to be charming, persuasive, and adaptable, skills he had been developing since childhood. He quickly became one of the company's top performers, earning recognition and respect from his supervisors. In 1964, John met and married Marlyn Myers, whose father owned a string of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Iowa. The marriage seemed to offer John everything he had always wanted: respectability, financial security, and acceptance into a successful family business. He threw himself into the role of devoted husband and ambitious businessman with characteristic intensity. The couple moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where John took over management of 3 KFC restaurants. By all accounts, he was an excellent manager, the restaurants were profitable, the employees respected him, and he became active in local community organizations. He joined the Gacy's, eventually rising to vice president of the local chapter. He was charming, hardworking, and seemingly destined for continued success. But beneath this veneer of respectability, John was engaging in increasingly dangerous behavior. He began making sexual advances toward young male employees, using his position of authority to coerce compliance. When word of his activities began to spread, he responded not with remorse but with more sophisticated manipulation. John's carefully constructed life in Iowa began to unravel in 1968 when one of his victims, Donald Voorhees, filed charges against him. Voorhees, the teenage son of a fellow Gacy, accused John of sexual assault. The case sent shockwaves through Waterloo's tight-knit business community, where John had been seen as a pillar of respectability. Rather than face the charges directly, John hired someone to assault Voorhees, hoping to intimidate the young man into dropping the case. The plan backfired spectacularly when the would-be attacker was caught and immediately implicated John as the person who hired him. On December 3, 1968, John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to 10 years in prison for sodomy. His wife Marlyn divorced him while he was awaiting trial, taking their 2 children and returning to her family. John's carefully constructed life had collapsed completely, and he found himself facing the prospect of a decade behind bars. Prison should have been a wake-up call, an opportunity for John to confront his behavior and make genuine changes. Instead, it became a finishing school for manipulation and deception. John was a model prisoner, charming guards and administrators while working to gain early release. He earned his GED, took college courses, and participated in every rehabilitation program available. But prison also exposed John to hardened criminals who taught him valuable lessons about avoiding detection and manipulating the legal system. He learned to be more careful about leaving evidence, more selective about his victims, and more sophisticated in his methods of control and intimidation. Most importantly, prison taught John that his public persona was his most valuable asset. The respectability he had cultivated in Iowa had nearly saved him from serious consequences. It was only the accumulation of evidence that had finally brought him down. He resolved that in the future, he would be even more careful to maintain his image as a solid citizen while pursuing his darker impulses. John was released from prison in June 1970 after serving just 18 months of his 10-year sentence. His good behavior and the recommendation of prison officials had earned him an early parole, a decision that would have devastating consequences for dozens of future victims. Upon his release, John returned to Chicago, where he moved in with his mother. Marion Gacy had remained loyal to her son throughout his imprisonment, visiting regularly and maintaining that he had been the victim of false accusations. Her support provided John with a base of operations as he worked to rebuild his life. He found work as a cook at a restaurant, a job that was beneath his previous status but necessary for someone with his criminal record. John chafed at the reduced circumstances but used the time to plan his comeback. He studied the restaurant business, saved money, and began cultivating new relationships that might prove useful in the future. In 1971, John was arrested again, this time for sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Chicago. But the charges were dropped when the victim failed to appear in court, possibly due to intimidation, though this was never proven. The incident should have been a violation of his parole, but somehow it never came to the attention of Iowa authorities. This near miss convinced John that he could continue his predatory behavior as long as he was more careful about victim selection and evidence disposal. He began to develop the methods that would characterize his later crimes, targeting young men who were unlikely to be immediately missed, using his charm and authority to lure them into vulnerable situations, and having a plan for disposal should things go wrong. In 1972, John started his own construction company, PDM Contractors. The initials stood for painting, decorating, and maintenance. The business was perfectly suited to his skills and needs. It allowed him to work independently, gave him access to properties where he could operate without supervision, and provided him with the tools and knowledge he would later use to conceal his crimes. John was a skilled businessman, and PDM Contractors quickly became successful. He hired crews of young men, many of them runaways or troubled teens who were grateful for steady work and didn't ask too many questions about their employer's past. John cultivated an image as a tough but fair boss who gave second chances to kids that other employers wouldn't hire. The construction business also gave John something he had craved since childhood: genuine respect and recognition. He was good at what he did, his employees looked up to him, and his customers appreciated his work. For the first time in his adult life, his public success wasn't just a facade, it was based on real accomplishments and genuine skills. In 1972, John also remarried. His new wife, Carol Hoff, was a divorcee with 2 young daughters. Like Marlon before her, Carol was attracted to John's charm, ambition, and apparent stability. He seemed like the kind of man who could provide security and respectability for her and her children. John threw himself into the role of husband and stepfather with characteristic intensity. He coached Little League Baseball, organized elaborate birthday parties for the girls, and seemed genuinely devoted to his new family. Neighbors saw him as a model citizen, a successful businessman who was devoted to his family and active in the community. But even as John was building this new life, the old patterns were reasserting themselves. He began making excuses to work late, claiming that business demands required him to be away from home at odd hours. Carol noticed strange smells coming from the basement and crawl space, but John always had explanations: sewer problems, chemical spills from work, dead animals that had crawled under the house to die. John's hunger for respectability and recognition led him into local Democratic politics in the mid-1970s. He became active in the 42nd Ward Democratic Organization, volunteering for campaigns and gradually working his way up the party hierarchy. His construction business had made him financially comfortable, and he was generous with political contributions. In 1975, John was appointed as a Democratic precinct captain, a position that gave him genuine political influence in his community. He took the role seriously, organizing voter registration drives, coordinating get-out-the-vote efforts, and serving as a liaison between constituents and elected officials. The political work suited John perfectly. It required charm, organization, and the ability to work with diverse groups of people. He was good at remembering names and faces, at making people feel heard and important, and at finding common ground between competing interests. His fellow Democrats saw him as a reliable party worker who could be counted on to deliver results. John's political activities also gave him access to influential people throughout Chicago's power structure. He rubbed shoulders with judges, police commanders, and city officials at political events and fundraisers. These connections would prove valuable in ways that his political allies never suspected. They gave John insights into how the system worked and confidence that his respectable public image would protect him from serious scrutiny. But politics also fed John's grandiose sense of self-importance. He began to see himself as a significant figure, someone whose opinion mattered and whose influence extended beyond his immediate circle. This inflated ego would eventually contribute to his downfall, as he became increasingly reckless and convinced of his own invincibility. Perhaps no aspect of John Wayne Gacy's public persona was more disturbing in retrospect than his work as Pogo the Clown. Beginning in the mid-1970s, John created several clown characters that he used to entertain at children's hospitals, charity events, and democratic political functions. Pogo was John's most famous creation, a cheerful clown with a painted smile, colorful costume, and repertoire of magic tricks and jokes. John claimed that entertaining children gave him great joy and satisfaction, and by all accounts, he was good at it. Children responded well to his performances, and parents appreciated his willingness to volunteer his time for worthy causes. The clown persona served multiple purposes for John. It enhanced his public image as a caring community member, provided him with access to vulnerable populations, and allowed him to hide behind a literal mask. The clown makeup and costume transformed him from John Wayne Gacy, ex-convict and businessman, into Pogo, beloved entertainer and friend to children. But there were troubling aspects to John's clown work that only became apparent later. He was particularly drawn to events where he would be around young boys, and several parents later reported feeling uncomfortable with the intensity of his interest in their children. He would often extend conversations beyond what seemed appropriate, asking detailed questions about children's home lives and family situations. John also used his clown persona as a way of deflecting suspicion about his private life. When neighbors or acquaintances asked about his lack of close relationships or his odd hours, he would joke that he was too busy entertaining children to have time for romance. The clown work provided him with a ready excuse for his secretive behavior while simultaneously enhancing his reputation as a caring, community-minded individual. In 1974, John purchased a ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in unincorporated Norwood Park Township, just outside Chicago's city limits. The house was modest but well-maintained, located in a middle-class neighborhood where residents took pride in their properties and looked out for each other. John immediately began making improvements to the property, using his construction skills to enhance both the house's appearance and its utility for his hidden purposes. He finished the basement, installed additional lighting, and made modifications to the crawl space that he claimed were for storage and utilities. The house became the center of John's social life. He threw elaborate parties for his neighbors, political associates, and business contacts, establishing himself as one of the neighborhood's most gregarious residents. The parties were legendary. John would spend weeks planning them, preparing elaborate meals, decorating the house, and ensuring that every guest felt welcome and entertained. But the same house that served as a venue for celebration and community building was also becoming a tomb. Beginning in 1972, John had started killing young men, and his new house provided him with the perfect place to dispose of the bodies. The crawl space beneath the house was accessible but rarely visited, and John's construction experience had taught him how to dig efficiently and how to use lime to accelerate decomposition. John's method was horrifyingly systematic. He would lure young men to his house with promises of work, money, or simply a place to party. Once there, he would incapacitate them through drugs, alcohol, or physical force, then kill them through strangulation or suffocation. He preferred what he called the rope trick, tying a rope around the victim's neck and using a stick to tighten it like a tourniquet. After the murders, John would drag the bodies to the crawl space and bury them in carefully organized rows. He kept detailed mental records of where each body was located, treating the crawl space like a macabre filing system. When the crawl space began to fill up, he started burying bodies in other parts of his property, under the garage, in the backyard, and eventually in the Des Plaines River when even his property couldn't accommodate more graves. John Wayne Gacy's victims were primarily young men and teenage boys, many of whom were runaways, hustlers, or otherwise marginalized individuals whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. This wasn't accidental. John deliberately targeted people who were vulnerable and whose absence was unlikely to generate significant police attention. His first known victim was Timothy McCoy, a 16-year-old from Michigan who disappeared in January 1972. McCoy had been traveling to Omaha, Nebraska, when he encountered John at a bus station in Chicago. John offered him a place to stay for the night, and McCoy was never seen alive again. The killings continued with increasing frequency throughout the 1970s. John Jack McCoy, no relation to Timothy, John Scyc, Robert Gilroy, John Mowry, Russell Nelson, Robert Winch, Tommy Bowling, David Talsma, William Kindred, Timothy O'Rourke, Frank Landingen, James Matsara, Robert Piest, each name represented a life cut short, a family left to wonder what had happened to their loved one. Many of John's victims were employed by PDM contractors at the time of their deaths. John would hire young men for construction work, then use his position as their employer to exert control over them. He might keep them working late, invite them to his house for dinner or drinks, or offer them a place to stay if they were having housing problems. This employer-employee relationship gave him access to his victims while providing a plausible explanation for why they had been at his house. John was particularly skilled at identifying vulnerable targets. He looked for young men who were estranged from their families, struggling financially, or dealing with issues related to their sexual identity. These individuals were less likely to have strong support networks that would immediately notice their absence and less likely to be taken seriously by police if they were reported missing. The victims came from diverse backgrounds. Some were college students working part-time jobs, others were street hustlers trying to survive on their own. Some were gay men exploring Chicago's underground nightlife, others were straight men who simply had the misfortune of needing work or a place to stay. What they all had in common was youth, vulnerability, and the tragic luck of crossing paths with John Wayne Gacy. Throughout the mid-1970s, there were numerous occasions when John's crimes nearly came to light. These near misses revealed both his growing recklessness and the systemic factors that allowed him to continue killing for so long. In 1975, John was questioned by police about the disappearance of John Scyc, a young man who had worked for PDM contractors. Scyc's car had been found abandoned, and witnesses had seen him with John on the day he disappeared. But John's explanation, that he had fired Scyc for poor work performance and that the young man had sold him the car before leaving town, was accepted without serious investigation. Similar incidents occurred repeatedly. Young men who worked for John would disappear, and when questioned, he would claim they had quit without notice or had been fired for theft or poor performance. His reputation as a respectable businessman and his political connections gave his statements credibility with investigating officers. John's wife Carol was becoming increasingly suspicious of her husband's behavior. The strange smells from the crawl space were getting worse, and John's explanations were becoming less convincing. She noticed that several of his young employees had disappeared, and John's explanations about their departures seemed inconsistent and evasive. In 1976, Carol discovered gay pornography and wallets belonging to several young men in John's possession. When she confronted him, John flew into a rage, threatening her with violence if she ever questioned him again. The incident marked the beginning of the end of their marriage, though Carol wouldn't leave immediately due to fear and financial dependence. Neighbors were also beginning to notice disturbing patterns. The smell from John's property was becoming overwhelming, particularly during hot weather. Several residents complained to local authorities, but John's explanations about sewer problems and construction debris were generally accepted. His status as a local businessman and Democratic precinct captain gave him credibility with officials who might otherwise have investigated more thoroughly. By 1978, John Wayne Gacy had killed at least 33 people, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His house had become a charnel house, with bodies buried throughout the property. The smell was so overwhelming that John had begun staying in hotels when the odor became unbearable, even for him. But John's luck was running out. His increasingly erratic behavior was attracting attention from multiple sources. His marriage to Carol had finally ended in divorce in 1976, and she had begun talking to friends and family about her suspicions regarding her ex-husband. Several families of missing young men had identified John as the last person to see their loved ones alive. Most importantly, John was becoming sloppy in his victim selection and disposal methods. The beginning of the end came on December 11, 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Pius disappeared after telling his mother he was going to see a contractor about a potential job. Pius's mother Elizabeth immediately contacted police when her son failed to return home, and the investigation quickly led to John Wayne Gacy and PDM contractors. Robert Pius was different from John's previous victims in several crucial ways. He came from a stable, loving family that immediately noticed his absence and demanded police action. He had told his mother specifically where he was going and why, providing investigators with a clear lead. Most importantly, he disappeared at a time when police were finally beginning to take seriously the pattern of missing young men in the Chicago area. When police questioned John about Pius's disappearance, his usual charm and deflection tactics failed to work. Detective Joseph Kozenzak was suspicious of John's overly detailed alibi and his nervous demeanor. Unlike previous investigators, Kozenzak was persistent, returning repeatedly with follow-up questions and refusing to accept John's explanations at face value. On December 13, 1978, police obtained a search warrant for John's house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. The warrant was ostensibly to look for evidence related to Robert Pius's disappearance, but investigators suspected they might find more than they were officially looking for. When officers arrived at the house, they were immediately struck by an overwhelming odor of decay. John's explanations about sewer problems and dead animals seemed inadequate to account for the stench that permeated the entire property. Detective David Hockmeister began examining the crawl space beneath the house and quickly discovered what appeared to be human remains. The discovery triggered one of the largest crime scene investigations in Chicago history. Over the next several days, investigators carefully excavated John's property, uncovering body after body in various states of decomposition. The crawl space alone contained 26 bodies, arranged in neat rows like merchandise in a warehouse. As the excavation continued, the full scope of John's crimes became apparent. Bodies were found under the garage, in the backyard, and buried in lime pits throughout the property. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 21, and most showed signs of having been tortured before death. Many were bound with rope, and several had clothing or objects shoved down their throats, indicating they had been suffocated or strangled. The investigation also revealed the systematic nature of John's killing spree. He had kept detailed records of his victims, including personal items that served as trophies. Police found wallets, identification cards, jewelry, and other belongings from dozens of young men, carefully organized and stored like collector's items. John initially denied any knowledge of the bodies, claiming that his employees must have buried them without his knowledge. But as the evidence mounted and the death toll climbed, his story became increasingly implausible. Finally, faced with overwhelming physical evidence and the testimony of surviving witnesses, John began to confess. John Wayne Gacy's confessions to police were both chilling and revealing, providing insights into the mind of a serial killer while demonstrating his continued attempts to manipulate and control the narrative of his crimes. John described his murders with disturbing detachment, referring to his victims as tricks and claiming that they had deserved their fate because they were gay or engaged in prostitution. He showed no remorse for the killings themselves, instead expressing annoyance that he had been caught and that his carefully constructed life was being destroyed. According to John's confessions, most of his murders followed a similar pattern. He would approach young men at bars, bus stations, or through his construction business, offering them work, money, or simply companionship. He would bring them to his house, where he would ply them with alcohol or drugs before suggesting they play what he called games. These games typically involved handcuffs, which John would present as sexual role-playing but which were actually his method of gaining complete control over his victims. Once the victims were restrained, John would torture them, sometimes for hours, before finally killing them through strangulation. He claimed that the power he felt during these murders was intoxicating, describing it as the ultimate form of control over another human being. John also revealed the practical aspects of his killing spree, describing how he had systematically disposed of bodies and covered up evidence. He had become expert at digging graves in the confined space of his crawl space, using lime to accelerate decomposition and minimize odors. When his property became too crowded with bodies, he had begun dumping victims in the Des Plaines River, weighted down with concrete blocks. Perhaps most disturbing were John's descriptions of his psychological state during the murders. He claimed to experience a complete disconnect from normal human emotions, describing himself as feeling like he was watching someone else commit the crimes. This dissociation allowed him to return to his normal life immediately after killing, hosting dinner parties and attending political meetings within hours of committing murder. John Wayne Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980, and quickly became a media sensation. The case had all the elements that fascinated the American public: a respected businessman leading a double life, victims who were young and vulnerable, and crimes that seemed to exceed the bounds of human comprehension. The prosecution, led by William Kunkel, faced the challenge of proving not just that John had committed the murders, but that he was legally sane at the time of the crimes. Illinois law required that defendants be able to understand the difference between right and wrong and be capable of conforming their behavior to the law. Given the systematic nature of John's crimes and his ability to maintain a normal public life, the prosecution argued that he clearly met these standards. John's defense team, led by Sam Amarant, pursued an insanity defense, arguing that no sane person could commit such horrific crimes. They presented evidence of John's troubled childhood, his history of head injuries, and his apparent inability to form normal human relationships. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that John suffered from multiple personality disorder and was driven by uncontrollable urges that he couldn't resist. The testimony during the trial was graphic and disturbing. Forensic experts described the condition of the bodies found on John's property, detailing the torture and abuse the victims had endured before death. Surviving witnesses testified about their narrow escapes from John's house, describing the rope trick and other methods he used to kill his victims. John himself was a complex figure during the trial. At times he seemed remorseful and confused, claiming not to remember many of the murders. At other times he was defiant and manipulative, attempting to charm the jury and portray himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. His multiple personalities seemed to emerge and disappear depending on the tactical needs of his defense. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. In addition to the physical evidence from John's property, they had confessions, witness testimony, and a clear pattern of predatory behavior stretching back years. They argued that John's ability to maintain his public facade while committing murders proved that he was legally sane and fully responsible for his actions. On March 13, 1980, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury found John Wayne Gacy guilty on all 33 counts of murder. The speed of the verdict reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him and the jury's rejection of his insanity defense. The penalty phase of the trial was equally swift. Under Illinois law, the jury had to decide whether John should receive the death penalty or life in prison. The prosecution argued that the systematic nature of his crimes, the torture inflicted on his victims, and the sheer number of murders made him deserving of the ultimate punishment. The defense pleaded for mercy, arguing that John's mental illness made him less culpable for his actions and that life in prison would be sufficient punishment. They brought in family members and character witnesses who testified about John's positive contributions to the community and his potential for rehabilitation. But the jury was unmoved by these appeals. On March 13, 1980, they sentenced John Wayne Gacy to death for 12 of the murders. Illinois law at the time limited death sentences to cases where specific aggravating factors were present. He also received 21 life sentences for the remaining murders and additional sentences for sexual assault and other charges. Judge Louis Garippo, in pronouncing the sentence, called John's crimes the most heinous and horrific he had ever encountered. He noted that John had shown no genuine remorse for his actions and had attempted to manipulate the legal system through false claims of mental illness. John Wayne Gacy spent the next 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois, pursuing appeals and maintaining his innocence despite his earlier confessions. His time in prison revealed the same manipulative personality that had characterized his life as a free man. John became something of a celebrity among death row inmates and crime enthusiasts. He gave numerous interviews to journalists, researchers, and documentary filmmakers, always maintaining his innocence and claiming that he had been framed by corrupt police officers and prosecutors. He seemed to enjoy the attention and used his notoriety to control and manipulate those around him. During his time in prison, John also took up painting, creating artwork that he sold to collectors fascinated by serial killer memorabilia. Many of his paintings featured clowns, skulls, and other dark imagery that seemed to reflect his psychological state. The fact that people were willing to pay significant amounts of money for artwork created by a mass murderer disturbed many observers and raised questions about society's fascination with criminal celebrities. John's appeals were consistently rejected by state and federal courts. His lawyers argued that he had been denied effective counsel, that evidence had been improperly admitted, and that he was mentally ill at the time of his crimes. But courts found these arguments unpersuasive, noting the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the systematic nature of his crimes. As his execution date approached, John continued to maintain his innocence, claiming that the real killers had never been caught. He refused to provide information about additional victims or to express genuine remorse for his crimes. This lack of cooperation and remorse only reinforced the public's perception of him as an irredeemable monster. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. He was 52 years old and had spent 14 years on death row pursuing unsuccessful appeals. John's final hours were marked by the same lack of remorse that had characterized his entire case. He ate a final meal of fried chicken, French fries, and strawberries, then met with his lawyer and spiritual advisor. When asked if he had any final words, John reportedly said, "Kiss my ass," a final act of defiance that was entirely consistent with his personality. The execution was witnessed by representatives of the victims' families, law enforcement officials, and members of the media. Many of those present reported feeling a sense of closure and justice, though they acknowledged that no punishment could truly balance the scales for the lives that had been lost. Outside the prison, crowds had gathered both to protest and to celebrate John's execution. The case had polarized public opinion about the death penalty, with some viewing his execution as necessary justice and others arguing that state-sanctioned killing was wrong regardless of the defendant's crimes. The John Wayne Gacy case had profound and lasting impacts on American society, law enforcement, and our understanding of serial murder. The sheer scale of his crimes, 33 confirmed victims, made him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history and forced a fundamental re-evaluation of how such predators could operate undetected for so long. From a law enforcement perspective, the Gacy case highlighted critical weaknesses in missing persons investigations, particularly when the victims came from marginalized communities. Many of John's victims were young gay men, runaways, or individuals from troubled backgrounds whose disappearances weren't taken as seriously as they should have been. The case led to improved protocols for investigating missing persons cases and better coordination between different police jurisdictions. The case also demonstrated the importance of recognizing patterns in seemingly unrelated disappearances. Had investigators connected the dots earlier, noting that multiple young men had disappeared after last being seen with the same contractor, lives might have been saved. This realization contributed to the development of more sophisticated computer databases and analytical tools for tracking criminal patterns across jurisdictions. While John Wayne Gacy's name became synonymous with evil, it's crucial to remember that his true legacy should be the 33 young men and boys whose lives he destroyed. Each victim was a person with dreams, relationships, and unlimited potential that was cut short by John's selfishness and cruelty. Robert Piest, whose disappearance finally brought John to justice, was just 15 years old when he died. He was a sophomore in high school, working part-time to save money for a car. His family described him as responsible, ambitious, and excited about his future. He had plans to become a pharmacist and was looking forward to getting his driver's license. Timothy McCoy, John's first known victim, was 16 when he encountered John at a Chicago bus station in 1972. Timothy was traveling from Michigan to Nebraska, trying to make a new start for himself. He was described by his family as gentle and trusting, qualities that made him vulnerable to John's predatory behavior. John Scyc was 19 when he disappeared in 1977. He had been working for PDM contractors and was saving money to attend college. His car, which John claimed to have purchased from him, became one of the first pieces of physical evidence linking John to his victims. Many of John's other victims remain unidentified even today. Their bodies were so decomposed when discovered that identification was impossible with the forensic techniques available in the 1970s. These unknown victims represent perhaps the greatest tragedy of the case, young men whose families never learned what happened to them, who were buried without their names, who became statistics rather than remembered individuals. The victims came from all walks of life. Some were college students working part-time jobs, others were young men struggling to make it on their own. Some were openly gay, others were still questioning their sexuality. Some came from loving families, others were estranged from their relatives. What they all shared was youth, vulnerability, and the misfortune of crossing paths with a predator who saw them not as human beings but as objects to be used and discarded. The discovery of John Wayne Gacy's crimes devastated the Chicago area community in ways that extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Neighbors who had attended his parties, eaten his food, and considered him a friend struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster who had been literally burying bodies beneath their feet. The psychological impact on the community was profound. Parents became more protective of their children, particularly teenage boys who might be vulnerable to predators. The case shattered the illusion that evil always announces itself clearly, showing instead that the most dangerous people could be those who seemed most trustworthy and respectable. Local businesses suffered as the area became associated with John's crimes. Property values in the neighborhood declined, and many residents moved away, unable to continue living so close to the site of such horror. The house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue was eventually demolished, but the psychological scars remained. The case also had a significant impact on Chicago's gay community. Many of John's victims were gay or questioning their sexuality, and the murders heightened fears about the dangers faced by young gay men in a society that often marginalized and stigmatized them. The case became a rallying point for LGBTQ+ activists who argued that police indifference to the disappearances of gay men had allowed John to continue killing for years. The John Wayne Gacy case became a media sensation that helped establish many of the patterns still seen in coverage of serial killer cases today. The contrast between John's public persona as Pogo the Clown and his private identity as a mass murderer provided irresistible material for journalists, authors, and filmmakers. The killer clown image became one of the most enduring and disturbing aspects of John's legacy. The juxtaposition of something associated with childhood innocence and joy, a clown, with unspeakable evil tapped into deep-seated fears and fascinations. This imagery has been referenced in countless books, movies, and television shows, contributing to a cultural association between clowns and danger that persists to this day. Numerous books have been written about the case, ranging from serious criminological studies to sensationalized true crime accounts. The quality and accuracy of these works have varied widely, with some providing valuable insights into John's psychology and methods while others have exploited the victim's suffering for commercial gain. The case has also been the subject of several documentary films and television specials, each attempting to understand how John was able to kill so many people while maintaining his facade of respectability. These productions have kept the case in the public consciousness and have introduced new generations to the story. John Wayne Gacy represented a particular type of serial killer that criminologists and psychologists have studied extensively. His ability to maintain a successful public life while committing horrific crimes in private made him a prime example of what experts call an organized serial killer. Unlike disorganized killers who act impulsively and leave obvious evidence, John was methodical, careful, and strategic in his approach to murder. He selected victims who were unlikely to be immediately missed, used his legitimate business as cover for accessing potential victims, and had well-developed plans for disposing of bodies and covering up evidence. John's psychology was complex and multifaceted. He displayed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, including a complete lack of empathy for his victims, a grandiose sense of self-importance, and a willingness to manipulate and exploit others for personal gain. His childhood abuse and troubled family relationships likely contributed to his inability to form normal emotional connections with other people. The sexual component of John's crimes was also significant. His victims were primarily young men, reflecting his own conflicted sexuality and his need to exert complete control over others. The torture and prolonged suffering he inflicted on his victims suggested a sadistic personality that derived pleasure from causing pain and fear. Perhaps most disturbing was John's complete compartmentalization of his different identities. He could host a dinner party hours after committing murder, perform as Pogo the Clown for children while bodies decomposed beneath his house, and participate in Democratic Party politics while actively hunting for new victims. This ability to maintain multiple, contradictory identities simultaneously was a key factor in his ability to avoid detection for so long. The John Wayne Gacy case drove several important innovations in forensic science and criminal investigation techniques. The scale of the crime scene, with 26 bodies buried in a crawl space alone, required unprecedented coordination between different forensic disciplines. The excavation of John's property was conducted with archaeological precision, with investigators carefully documenting the location and condition of each body. This systematic approach provided valuable information about John's methods and timeline while ensuring that evidence was properly preserved for trial. The identification of victims also pushed the boundaries of forensic science. With many bodies severely decomposed, investigators had to rely on dental records, clothing, and personal effects to determine identities. The case highlighted the importance of missing persons databases and dental record keeping in identifying unknown victims. The case also contributed to advances in forensic psychology and criminal profiling. John's ability to maintain a normal public facade while committing serial murders provided valuable insights into the psychology of organized serial killers and helped refine investigative techniques for identifying and catching similar predators. The prosecution and trial of John Wayne Gacy set several important legal precedents and contributed to changes in how serial murder cases are handled by the courts. The sheer number of victims and the systematic nature of the crimes challenged existing legal frameworks and required innovative approaches to prosecution. One significant issue was how to handle multiple murder charges against a single defendant. The prosecution had to decide which cases to prioritize, how to present evidence efficiently, and how to avoid overwhelming the jury with the sheer volume of horrific details. The strategies developed in the Gacy case have been used as models for subsequent mass murder prosecutions. The case also contributed to ongoing debates about the insanity defense in criminal law. John's defense team argued that no sane person could commit such crimes, while the prosecution maintained that his ability to function normally in society proved his legal sanity. The jury's rejection of the insanity defense helped establish precedents for similar cases involving serial killers who maintain outwardly normal lives. The death penalty phase of John's trial also set important precedents for how aggravating and mitigating factors should be weighed in capital cases. The systematic nature of his crimes, the torture inflicted on victims, and the lack of genuine remorse were all factors that influenced the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. More than 4 decades after his arrest, John Wayne Gacy remains one of the most studied and infamous serial killers in American history. His case continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and the general public because it challenges our basic assumptions about how evil manifests itself in society. John wasn't the stereotypical monster lurking in shadows or living on society's margins. He was successful, well-connected, and apparently well-liked by those who knew his public persona. He coached Little League, entertained children as Pogo the Clown, and was active in Democratic politics. He seemed, in many ways, to be living the American dream. This respectability was both John's greatest weapon and the source of his ultimate downfall. It allowed him to avoid suspicion for years while providing him with access to victims and disposal sites. But it also meant that when his crimes were finally discovered, the revelation was all the more shocking and devastating to those who had trusted him. The John Wayne Gacy case teaches us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. The most dangerous predators are often those who have learned to mimic normal human behavior while pursuing their darkest impulses. They exploit our natural tendency to trust those who seem successful, respectable, and community-minded. Perhaps most importantly, the case reminds us of the humanity of the victims. John saw his victims as objects to be used and discarded, but each was a person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Robert Pius wanted to buy a car and become a pharmacist. Timothy McCoy was trying to build a new life for himself. John Scyc was saving money for college. Their lives had value and meaning that extended far beyond their tragic ends. The 33 young men who died at John Wayne Gacy's hands were more than just statistics or case studies. They were sons, brothers, friends, and individuals with unlimited potential. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just as footnotes to a killer's crimes, but as celebrations of lives that were cut tragically short. In the end, John Wayne Gacy's true crime wasn't just murder, it was the theft of human potential, the destruction of families, and the violation of the basic trust that allows communities to function. That violation of trust, perhaps more than the murders themselves, represents his most lasting and damaging legacy. The case continues to resonate because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the reliability of appearances, and our own vulnerability to those who would exploit our trust. John Wayne Gacy showed us that monsters can wear familiar faces, and that recognition has changed how we see the world around us. Today, the lot where John's house once stood is empty, but the lessons of his crimes continue to inform how we protect our communities and investigate suspicious disappearances. The victims' families continue to grieve their losses while working to ensure that their loved ones are remembered for who they were, not just how they died. John Wayne Gacy is gone, executed for his crimes in 1994. But the questions his case raised about the nature of evil, the reliability of public personas, and the vulnerability of marginalized communities remain as relevant today as they were when his crimes first came to light. His story serves as a permanent reminder that we must remain vigilant, that we must take seriously the disappearances of all people regardless of their social status, and that we must never forget the human cost of allowing monsters to hide behind masks of respectability.